The Declaration of Independence declared that all men are created equal and endowed with rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At the same time, American slavery, which preceded the Declaration by nearly 2 centuries, had not only grown by 1776, it soon found protection in the Constitution. America was born under a terrible paradox between American slavery and American freedom. The eventual end of slavery would bring a new birth of freedom. Before then, however, the American paradox would give way to civil war. Slavery stretches back 5 millennia to Mesopotamia, the first civilization, and has been entrenched in every major civilization that followed. So many Slavs were sold into slavery on the European, Asian, and African continents, their name became synonymous with the term slave. North Africans traded in black slaves several centuries before their European counterparts. The vast majority of slaves that came to the Americas in the transatlantic slave trade were caught and sold within Africa by black Africans. Of the 12 million African slaves shipped to the Americas via the transatlantic trade, about 10.7 million survived the brutal conditions suffered on the slave ships. Of those millions, 388,000, or just under 4%, arrived in what became the United States. The first African slaves likely to arrive in America were brought to St. Augustine, Florida, a Spanish settlement founded in 1565. The first documented sale of African slaves to English settlers was in Jamestown, Virginia, in 1619. At the time, colonial slave laws were not yet clearly established. In 1640, the black African John Punch escaped from his wealthy Virginia master, along with 2 white indentured servants. All 3 were caught. Each man was whipped for escaping. The white servants received extended indentures. Punch, however, was sentenced to servitude for life. He was the first black African made a permanent slave by law in America. In 1662, a Virginia law determined that a child's status followed the mother, thereby making slavery hereditary. In 1667, the same state determined that baptism, which had been one route to freedom, would no longer be a factor in freeing someone from slavery. In 1676, Nathaniel Bacon led a rebellion against Governor William Berkeley of Virginia. Among the 200 men who joined Bacon, there were poor whites, free blacks, and black slaves. After the rebellion was crushed, Virginia's ruling class expanded lifetime slavery for Africans and their descendants. Poor whites, on the other hand, were granted easier access to land, the right to bear arms, and elevated legal status above black people. By 1776, the number of black slaves in America had grown to nearly 600,000. Southerners were not alone in owning slaves. For example, on the eve of the American Revolution, out of an estimated population of 23,000 in New York City, there were approximately 3,000 black slaves. By the end of the 18th century, however, the line of demarcation between North and South was emerging more clearly. The American founders were deeply divided over slavery. At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, they struck a compromise. Without ever mentioning the term slave, the Constitution protected the slave trade until 1808, counted a slave as only 3/5 of a person, and mandated that fugitive slaves be returned across state lines. The act prohibiting importation of slaves was passed in 1807. It was signed into law on March 2, 1807, by President Thomas Jefferson, a slaveholder, and took effect on January 1, 1808, the earliest possible date that the Constitution permitted the end of the slave trade. There were early attempts to make American freedom prevail over American slavery. Driven largely by Quaker Christians, America was host to the first convocation for abolition in 1775. In 1777, the independent Republic of Vermont, not yet a state, became the first modern polity to abolish slavery, more than 30 years before the end of the slave trade in Britain and more than 50 years before the British ended slavery altogether. In 1780, Pennsylvania set abolition into gradual motion. In 1783, Massachusetts was the first American state to abolish slavery altogether. By 1804, every northern state had either abolished slavery or set into motion gradual abolition. In the years following the Revolutionary War, Southern slaveholders for the first time experienced pressure to free their slaves, an effort resulting in some manumissions. Operating mainly between the 1830s and 60s, the Underground Railroad freed an estimated 100,000 slaves through a network of people, houses, and routes. When the Civil War broke out, the North was primarily motivated to end secession and restore the Union. The newly elected Lincoln was concerned to do so in a way that maintained loyalty to the Union in Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, all border states. The president did not immediately emancipate slaves in those states. But motivation changed. As the Civil War progressed and as Union soldiers advanced into Confederate territory and saw the cruelty and scope of Southern slavery for the first time, they reported back to families and sweethearts. This helped shift public opinion in the North. Union generals were increasingly convinced that in order to break the South, they had to break the institution of slavery. And Lincoln, who had always been opposed to slavery, moved increasingly toward emancipation as a moral necessity. In his 1863 Gettysburg Address, the president called for the North to prove the proposition that all men are created equal. He knew that the Confederacy must be defeated and the slave must be freed. Before the graves of the fallen, Lincoln called forth a new birth of freedom, at once the emancipation of America's black slaves and the renewal of the American Republic. In the end, if America was born under the terrible paradox between slavery and freedom, she would finally become the only country in the history of the world to fight a civil war to end slavery for the cause of freedom.